Greetings all, this is Rick Levine with your October 2023 astrological forecast. Before we get into the forecast, there's a couple of announcements that I need to make. I'll do this as briefly as possible because I know a lot of you want to get into the astrological meat. But first and foremost, I would like to announce that after 20 plus years of being online, stariq.com, which was my first astrological foray onto the internet with my astrological partner, Jeff Jower, who many of you knew his amazing work. Jeff passed away a number of years ago. And StarIQ has officially gone off the air. In fact, if you type stariq.com, you will now be redirected to my new website, which is really just getting started. There's not much there yet. However, what is there is your ability to sign on to a mailing list. Now, the reason why you may want to do this is because I will not overwhelm you with advertisements and daily announcements and promotions. I know sometimes when you sign up to mailing lists, you wish you didn't. There will be a way to get off this mailing list just simply with an unsubscribe button. But this is the way that I'm going to be able to be in touch with you to do some of these announcements that I do at the beginning of the YouTube events because it's the only way I can get a hold of anyone out there. So if you want to be on my email list, and it will be an occasional newsletter, probably the beginning of each month. And for those of you who don't want to log on to YouTube and watch the entire thing, you can get my monthly summary there in the monthly newsletter. And so go to Rick Levine Astrologer, all one word, ricklevineastrologer.com, and sign up for the mailing list. No cost and no commitment. When you want to unsubscribe, unsubscribe. But as you probably realize that when you watch this on YouTube or you follow someone on Instagram or whatever, there's no way for us to get a hold of you directly, and this will hopefully give me the ability to be able to stay in touch with many of you who would like that. So please do that, and I'm going to be, for the first time in all of my internet work, be building a mailing list and being responsive to it. So go to ricklevineastrologer.com and sign up for the email list. That's number one. Number two, Astrology Night at Soul Food Bookstore. The next one will be on Friday night, October 6th. That is the first Friday of the month, and that is at 6:30 p.m. on Friday evening in Redmond, Washington. For those of you who live in the Seattle or area or the Redmond, Washington or Pacific Northwest, and you want to make the trek over, we have a lot of fun. It's a great evening, and I do a different version of the forecast ahead and talk a little bit about the bigger picture in astrology and what's going on. For those of you who don't live in the area, it will be live streamed on YouTube. That's at 6:30 p.m. on Friday, October 6th, and that is Pacific Daylight Time, so adjust to your time zone. For those of you who can't make it because you're elsewhere on the planet and it's the middle of the night or whatever, it will be on YouTube later on, archived there, and feel free to check it out later on the YouTube page. That's number two. Number three is, this is a quick reminder that on the weekend of October 13th through 15th, and that is eclipse weekend, that I will be joining Rachel Lang for a weekend at the Omega Institute, which is just north of New York City, and we will be doing a weekend workshop called Liberating Venus, Love, and Abundance, and this is about the awakening the power to receive with astrology, using astrology as a tool to be open to receiving that which comes into our lives. Sometimes we focus on intentions and wish lists and all these things, and then when something comes to us, we don't even know how to receive it. So we will be doing this a weekend on workshop. we will be doing this weekend workshop about Venus and exploring how to attract more meaningful relationships, to increase our overall relationship with abundance, and embodying Venus. And it'll be an exciting and fun weekend. It'll be a small group. And by the way, my understanding is that Omega Residential is now sold out. The workshop is still open. There's a number of places nearby. When you call to register, or if you contact them, they will give you places nearby where you can stay and still be a part of this weekend. So that is the 13th through the 15th. That's number 3. Number 4 is that in the month of November, I will be doing a 4-week course through Astrology Hub. And this course is going to be a course about working with harmonic aspects. And this is going to be the third in a series of chart reading extravaganzas, which means that for 4 weeks, I'm going to be doing 4 charts per week live of people who are registered for the course. And we're going to be focusing on how do we make sense in doing charts and incorporating things like the half squares, the semi-squares, and sesqui-squares, and incorporating the magic of the soulful quintiles, creative quintiles, and how do we incorporate the power of the supernatural and otherworldly septiles, and so on. So this is going to be a hands-on, practical, for some of you have taken the harmonic course, The Fundamentals of Astrology Harmonics. But this basically, whether you've taken that or not, is getting right to the meat of working with these aspects. It's not as complicated as it might sound. It's going to be a lot of fun. And you can right now sign up for the wait list with no commitment at all. And by going to astrologyhub.com/extra3, and the extra stands for extravaganza, and this is the third one, astrologyhub.com/extra3. And just by signing up for the wait list, enrollment is not open yet, you'll receive an exclusive harmonic aspects cheat sheet that we've created for you. And so even if you don't take the course, you can sign up for that. And that's going to be once a week through the month of November. And we have some surprises attached to that class also. That's harmonic aspects. That was number 4. And the 5th and final thing is I just want to mention in passing, I've been talking about this for a little bit, and that is between December 6th and December 16th, I will be facilitating a 10-day retreat called Initiation into Astrology in the south part of Goa, India. This is on the Arabian Sea on the Malabar coast. It's very, very beautiful. It's a tropical climate. We're about a 3 or 4 minute walk down to the beach, and it's a beautiful swimming beach. It's at an Ayurvedic healing spa retreat center, and there is some room. It's filling up. Matter of fact, it's nearly full, but there is still some room available, and this will probably be the last chance to enroll, because I imagine by the end of October this is going to be full. So if you're interested in that, explore the day-by-day program, a very detailed curriculum. We'll be doing a lot of hands-on astrodrama and planet incarnation, channeling embodying the planets, working with the energies, standing in our own charts, play acting the energies. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or professional astrologer, this has something for everyone. It's a 10-day retreat, and you can find out more about that by going to heavenandearthworkshops.com, heavenandearthworkshops.com. This will be the 11th workshop that I've done that's been produced and managed by them. It's an amazing package that basically, from the moment you get off the plane to the moment you get back on the plane, you're taken care of. So check that out. If you have any questions on that in specific, feel free to send me an email or just go to heavenandearthworkshops.com. that's it. Thank you for allowing me to share those things with you. And now let's switch gears and talk about the month of October. So I am recording this on the afternoon of September 30th, and it's 4:27 p.m. at this moment right now, and the moon is almost at 29 degrees of Aries. So the moon is getting ready to shift into Taurus, and it will be doing that over the next couple of hours. And so that's what's going on in the sky. But the other thing that's of interest right now as I'm recording this, and I think this is a very powerful moment, because we have Uranus that's absolutely highlighted at this moment as we move into the beginning of October, because we have Venus having just squared Uranus, but still Venus square Uranus is within a degree of orb. We have Mars creating a quincunx with Uranus, and that quincunx with Uranus is within 6 minutes of orb and applying. So that Mars quincunx Uranus is a bit disruptive, and many people that I've already been talking with today have had a bit of a crazy yesterday, today, as that Mars pushes towards the quincunx with Uranus. That's exact in a few hours. But also we have the sun at 7.5 degrees of Libra, making a square and a half, a sesqui-square to Uranus. And that's 1 minute of arc and applying right now. And that is also a bit, if not disruptive, it's motivational. It makes us go into action. And I've said this many times. We'll cover this in the chart extravaganza in November through Astrology Hub, but semi-squares and sesqui-squares are not less powerful than squares. They're not minor aspects, meaning that they're less important. They're, in fact, way more focused, and when they're exact, they're very, very intense. And right now, at this moment, we have the sun making a nearly exact 1/60th of a degree away from being exact, the sun making that square and a half or sesqui-square with Uranus. And because Venus is making a square with Uranus, what that means is that the sun is also making a half square with Venus. That's 1 degree orb. But the sun, Venus, and Uranus together is creating a very powerful aspect scenario, as is Mars and Venus and Uranus, creating another one, because we have Venus sextiling Mars and squaring Uranus, while Mars is quincunxing Uranus. Uranus is in high focus right now, and anything can happen. And so even the subways in New York City could flood. Oh, well, that already happened yesterday. All right, so moving into October, but I just wanted to focus on that chart for a moment, because it's just such a stunning moment, and it really does show that sometimes if we don't look at the semi-squares and sesqui-squares, we may be missing maybe what's the most important thing in the chart. That's not always the case, but it certainly can be the case. So the thing about October is that on the surface, it seems like there's a lot happening. And to some extent there is, but it's a lot of noise. It's a very noisy month because the inner planets, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, are all direct now after Venus spent forever in Leo. We begin the month still with Venus in late Leo, but over the month, Venus travels through the rest of Leo, moves out of its shadow on the 7th, and by the 8th, it's in Virgo, and by the end of the month, it's really toward the end of Virgo. Venus, during the month, moves almost an entire sign. It moves nearly 30 degrees. And so Venus is back on the move. We can expect that stuff to move into new places. All those things that have been somewhat on hold, maybe going back to when Venus first entered Leo back on June 5th. And June 19th, Venus entered its shadow. And on October 7th, Venus leaves its shadow. So this whole period of time of mid-June through July and August, all of September, we've been going through stuff with Venus having to do with our attractions, our desires, our relationship to others, our relationship to money. All these things have been kind of in a whirlpool of moving forward, not moving forward, back again, kind of like tied up in some sort of vortex, perhaps is the right word. And although Venus turned direct back on September 3rd, it's taken nearly a month, or actually over a month, for Venus to go back through all of the territory that it retrograded back through originally, and it actually leaves its shadow on October 7th, and by October 8th, it moves into Virgo, and we're into new territory with Venus. So this gives us the feeling like something new is really happening. Now, by the same token, Mars has been already moving fast. It's been the only planet these last couple of months that's not been retrograde, and that just continues to move into new territory. And at the beginning of October, Mars is at about 23 degrees of Libra. And by the end of October, Mars is halfway through Scorpio, which means that Mars is moving about as fast as it ever goes. Mars, typically takes 2 months to move through a sign, or about that. And so Mars is moving through about a little bit more than half of a sign, moving from Libra, actually almost through a whole sign, from 23 degrees of Libra through mid-Scorpio in the month of October. So Mars is really pushing and pushing our boundaries and moving us physically into new territory. Then we get to Mercury. Mercury, having come out of a retrograde back in mid-September, a couple of weeks ago, and Mercury moved out of its shadow, technically just yesterday, or the day before yesterday, on September 29th. And normally when I refer to days, once I have a chart up, when I say today, I always mean the date of the chart that we're looking at. And just for the record, when we're looking at charts, we'll be looking at charts typically for noon Pacific Daylight Time. And so there's no horizon, there's no ascendant. You can adjust the planets to your time zone. But Mercury left its shadow late on the 29th of September, which means that Mercury is moving direct all month through October, but it's just barely getting going into new territory. It's moving forward, and it's actually moving forward quite quickly right now. And in fact, Mercury, as it moves direct through the month of October, really covers a lot of territory, because on October 1st, Mercury is at 24 Virgo, and on November 1st, Mercury is at 16 Scorpio, meaning that it moves almost through 2 full signs. It's moving about twice as fast as the sun, which really is going to give us the speed of thinking, of interaction, of busyness. And so with Mercury, Venus, and Mars all moving ahead, and all moving ahead quite quickly, it feels like there's a lot going on. Oh, and on top of that, because these planets are moving quickly, we have planets changing signs. I think I mentioned we have Venus moving into Virgo on October 8th. We have Mercury having moved direct. It moves into Libra on October 4th, but it moves into Scorpio by October 21st, having spent, a little bit over 2 weeks flying through Libra. It's an air sign, so it's flying through Libra. On top of that, Mars changes signs, moving into Scorpio on October 11th. And of course, the sun changes signs once a month, and the sun moves into Scorpio on October 23rd. Now, on top of all of that, we have 2 eclipses this month. And so there's a lot going on. Oh, and I didn't mention that the first of all the outer planets, which one by one will each turn direct, over the months ahead. But on October 10th, Pluto, which has retrograded all the way back to 27 degrees of Capricorn, having moved into Aquarius back in March of this year, retrograding back into Capricorn in May. Now Pluto turns direct. It doesn't move back into Aquarius until January of 2024, but Pluto is the first inkling that these deeper planets are going to be moving forward. And here's the punchline about October, and that is, although the inner planets are all moving quickly, they're all moving forward, things are exciting, things are happening. There are two eclipses that we'll talk about more in depth in a few minutes. And eclipses stir things up. They pop things. They bring things into awareness because we have to separate from something that isn't what we thought it was, or something gets left behind, or there's some shift of energy that can be rather abrupt or sudden. But the outer planets ain't moving, meaning that even though there's a lot of it's like being in the ocean and having a lot of turmoil on the top of the ocean, and we're in a boat, and so we feel the turmoil. But if we go down a foot or two, there's not much movement. And for anybody who's done any scuba diving, you know that it can be exactly the opposite. It can be smooth as glass on the top of the ocean. You drop down to 30 or 40 or 50 feet, and the swells can be overwhelmingly powerful, but on the surface, it's calm. Well, right now, on the surface, it's noisy, but on the deep, there's not a lot of movement going on, even though it might feel terribly disturbing and disruptive and even anxiety producing with so much noise on the surface. And I think this is really important because Pluto is almost at 28 degrees of Capricorn on the first of the month. And let's actually look at a chart now for October 1st at noon. And we can see that Pluto is almost at 28 degrees of Capricorn. It's at 27 degrees Capricorn and 55 minutes, and it's still retrograde for another 10 days. But by the end of the month, Pluto on November 1st is at 28 degrees 0 minutes of Capricorn, meaning that Pluto moves 5 minutes of orb. 5 minutes of orb is 1/12 of a degree for the entire month. So in other words, for all practical purposes, Pluto ain't moving all month. Now remember, one of the basic laws of astrology is that the faster moving the planet, the shorter the duration of whatever the energy is that it's bringing up, and therefore the more acute. It can be very powerful, but things that are prompted or triggered by the sun or the moon or Mercury or even Venus or Mars can be very transient unless they're held on by a deeper energy, a slower moving planet. So with Pluto not moving 5 minutes of arc all month, that tells us something very important. And there are some very important aspects to Pluto this month that really signify how important a month it is in the long term, even though we may not see the ramifications of what comes from the events that are initiated this month. As we move into Neptune, Neptune is also retrograde, and Neptune at the beginning of the month is at 25 degrees 56 minutes Pisces, just about 26 degrees. At the end of the month, Neptune is at 25 degrees 13 minutes, still retrograde. In fact, by January 1st, Neptune is still at 25 degrees and 5 minutes of Pisces. Neptune, like Pluto, isn't moving. And in fact, between the two of them, they're barely moving at all. And then when we bring ourselves into Uranus, Uranus at the beginning of the month is at 22.5 degrees, 22 degrees Taurus, 37 minutes. At the end of the month, it's only at 21.5 degrees, meaning that Uranus barely moves 1 degree or moves just 1 degree over the entire month. So Uranus isn't moving very fast either. Saturn, which is retrograde but is slowing down because it turns direct in November. Saturn turns direct on November 4th. that Saturn at the beginning of October is at about 1.5 degrees of Pisces, actually 1 degree, 26 minutes of Pisces. And by the end of the month, it's retrograded all the way back to 0 degrees Pisces, 31 minutes, meaning it's moved 1 degree over an entire month. And in fact, if we take it another month, by December 1st, it's back to 1 degree Pisces, 10 minutes. So between October 1st and December 1st, Saturn makes no progress at all. It basically retrogrades back a degree and moves forward a degree. And so for all practical purposes, Saturn is kind of stationary for 2 months. And even Jupiter, which is moving a bit faster, at the beginning of the month is at 14 degrees, 22 minutes of Taurus. And it retrogrades back 4 degrees, almost 4 degrees to 10 degrees of Taurus and 42 minutes by November 1st. And Jupiter even retrogrades back by the first of the year to 5.5 degrees of Taurus, and then it turns direct. So we're getting some energy out of Jupiter, but it's not forward motion. It's replaying old news from different perspectives. We're seeing things. Jupiter's expanding. It's the magnifying lens, but it's magnifying what's already gone on from a different perspective, from a different point of view. So the point is here that on the surface, October is incredibly noisy and it feels like there's a huge amount going on. And there is. I mean, look, if you're in a canoe or a kayak on the ocean or on a lake and the storm is stirring things up, you're at the mercy of whatever's happening on the surface. But as the storm passes, the stuff that's down beneath, I was trying to say beneath and below at the same time, the stuff that's going on beneath the surface is the longer lasting, and that's what's important. And it's really significant to keep in mind that it's easy to get frustrated through this period of time of October, November, even December. Even though things are going to feel like they're moving forward, they're not moving forward fast enough. Or they may be moving forward so fast on the surface that it's like we don't have time to catch up to it, and therefore we're not making the progress that we think we should be making or that we would like to make. So we begin the month of October with the Sun and Mars in Libra and a bunch of planets in Taurus. Actually, the Moon and Jupiter and Uranus are all in Taurus. And there's still a feeling that I know I talked about in the September forecast. And for those of you who are on Patreon and get the mid-month update, I dug in a bit deeper to the end of September and all the quincunxes that were going on between the planets in Libra and the planets in Taurus, and also the planets in Libra making quincunxes with Neptune. And we begin October with some of that same energy. But there's also a bit of that disruptive Uranian energy that is certainly cooking, and that we have that to contend with. The first significant aspect in October that I want to talk about is on October 2nd, Mercury moving through Virgo makes an opposition to Neptune. Now, this is significant because it's the first aspect that Mercury makes that is out of its shadow. In other words, all the aspects that Mercury made toward the second part of September were aspects that Mercury had made already and then retrograded, made them again, and then went direct and made them a third and final time. Now that Mercury is moving out of its shadow and making this opposition to Neptune, this whole thing of deception and confusion is coming to the surface on another layer, and we may have a day or two of not being quite sure what's going on. However, that Mercury, at the same time as it's making the opposition to Neptune on the 2nd, by the 3rd, it's making a trine to Pluto. And this is hugely significant because Mercury is actually coming out of a trine that it made to Uranus a few days ago. And now it makes the opposition to Neptune on the 2nd, spiritual connection, bringing us out of the material world, awareness beyond the boundaries, something that may be hard to assimilate because we don't understand it. But then by the 3rd, Mercury makes a trine to Pluto, and that grounds the energy. Remember, Pluto is stationary for all practical purposes. It ain't moving. So this is like a deeper understanding of what's going on. It's a very powerful aspect. And we're also coming into the focus on Neptune, because remember, Mercury opposing Neptune on the 2nd, but Venus makes a quincunx with Neptune, and that's exact also on the 3rd. And Mars is coming out of that quincunx, or actually moving into the quincunx with Neptune. And so we kind of have this yod, this sextile between Venus and Mars, which is not quite exact, but it's very close. I mean, the Venus-Mars sextile is about 1.5 degrees, while Venus and Mars are both making quincunxes to Neptune, while Mercury is opposing Neptune, and yet Mercury is trining Pluto. I know that's a lot of astrology jargon, but the point here is that there's a huge amount of energy going on, and although we're getting some stuff that's very deep and very powerful that's coming out and coming to the surface, that's being communicated Mercury in a way that has a perspective that is powerful, profound. We can't just ignore it. Well, we can, and the way we ignore it is we put in our earplugs, our brain plugs, and we close our eyes and we go, I don't want to know, I'm not going to listen, But, ignorance is not bliss, it's just ignorance. And so we have an opportunity here to maybe be confronted with things that may in fact change our mind about a variety of things on a local level, on a personal level, relating to our job, our home, our family, how we communicate with others, but also on a larger community level, global level, political level, certainly. And that stuff is not going away, and that's certainly a lot of what this is about. But that Mercury trining Pluto and the Venus quincunxing Neptune, there's a sense of we're getting deep and powerful communication, but something doesn't feel right. It's not easy to assimilate what it is that we are learning. And then by the 4th, what happens is that Mercury actually moves into an exact square and a half, a sesqui-square to Jupiter. Now remember, the sesqui-squares, or it's a 90-degree angle plus a half of a 90-degree angle, so it's 90 plus 45 degrees is 135 degrees, that this square and a half exacerbates what's ever going on, and it motivates us to do something about it. But because it's Jupiter, we might overreact. And so on October 4th, while Mercury is making that square and a half to Jupiter, we're now communicating things, and we may be overstating them, we may be exaggerating them, we may even be telling a bit of a white lie as we over-exaggerate too much, because at the same time, we're also getting Mars moving over the nodal axis. That's exact also on the 4th. And in fact, the Mercury sesqui-square to Jupiter happens just hours before it moves into Libra. That's Mercury moving into Libra at 5 o'clock in the evening, 5:08 p.m. And so by the end of October 4th, we're in a little bit of a different world than we were before that, although we haven't still integrated everything. We haven't processed it. Why? Because by October 5th, Mercury, by October 5th, is making an exact quincunx to Saturn. And again, we're seeing these semi-squares, sesqui-squares, quincunxes that are they're not the open conflict of a square. They're not the conflict that can encourage creative resolution. They're more about a motivation to do something about something that isn't quite right. And so Mercury making that quincunx to Saturn by October 5th is like an adjustment that we have to make in order to deal with reality. This is Mercury to Saturn, and it may not be comfortable. It's like there's no easy solution. And I'm aware that during this whole period of time in the United States, aside from all the other craziness that we have going on that seems to just continue and continue, we have this, budget thing, which by the time I talk about, this, it may already be resolved, but it's only resolved on the surface. There's a deeper conflict going on between Mercury and Libra trying to find balance. The Sun is in Libra, Mars is in Libra. Mars is in Libra on the nodal axis, but they're quincunxing Mercury, quincunxing Saturn. It's like what we're saying to make things okay, and the deeper confusion of Saturn and Saturn in Pisces, where Saturn can't quite get the structure that it normally has because Pisces fuzzes it out. And on top of that, Mars is now moving also into that exact quincunx with Neptune. That's not exact until later on the 5th. But on the 5th, we also have the Sun making a half square to Venus, which we talked about at the opening at the opening of the month when it was a 1 degree orb. Well, now it's exact. There's a lot of conflict going on. This is not an easy opening to a month. But again, these are not about long-lasting deep things, but they're stirring up the long-lasting deep things that don't quite get resolved. As we move on to the 6th, we have more quincunx. We have Venus making a quincunx to Pluto. And again, between the Mars quincunx to Neptune on the 5th, which is our energy, Mars physically trying to resolve things in a diplomatic, sensible way, to Neptune, it's still being confused, where we might have higher ideals, Neptune, but we can't bring them into fruition. And then by the 6th, when Venus moves into the exact quincunx with Pluto, again, these are deep feelings that are not comfortable. It's almost like there's no winners here. And on top of that, we have something else that's picking up that's exact on the 8th, but we're already feeling it. We're probably feeling it even from the beginning of the month, even from the end of September, and that is Mars is inching closer and closer to an exact square to Pluto. Now, remember, I said Pluto's station on the 10th is significant because as a planet moves slower and slower, it gains more power. It's not momentum going anywhere. It's inertia that is immovable. And Venus's quincunx to Pluto on the 6th, tied to Mars's square to Pluto on the 8th, creates a whole lot of deep intensity, emotional battling that's coming to the surface. This is power structure, authority that's not just Saturn, I make the rules. This is Pluto, I hold the position that the people who make the rules have to adhere to. This is a deeper level of reality that has to do with unconscious. It has to do with the power of tyranny and of control and of fascism, of the control by the rich and powerful that's never quite on the surface and never obvious. And as Mars moves through this square that's exact on the 8th, let's move the chart through the 8th. By the way, on the 7th, the moon is moving through Cancer, kind of again holding energy back a little bit, strengthening our emotions, our feelings. But by the time we get to the 8th, the moon has moved into Leo. We're now wanting to express ourselves outwardly. On the 8th, we have Mars making that exact square from 27 Libra to 27 Capricorn, and this is incredibly dynamic. I think that we can see one of the many power struggles that's being played out on the global or national level in the United States, or even in our individual lives. We can see this kind of coming out into the open. This is not an easy energy. Also on the 8th, by late in the day, Venus, which has been moving through Leo back since early June, since June 5th. Normally, Venus moves through a sign in less than a month, but Venus has been in Leo much of June, all of July, August, and September. And now when Venus on the 8th, later in the day, Venus actually at 6:10 p.m. Pacific time, Venus moves out of Leo into Virgo. And once it does, we will begin to feel much stronger the opposition that Venus has already been moving toward. That is its opposition to Saturn. This is an opposition that may not feel good. It may feel like our emotional needs and what we want, and maybe even money, we're being held back. There's restraint, and yet this sense of restraint, and it could be fiscal restraint even on a national level, it could be the fact that this holding back that Saturn does actually builds momentum for what occurs later on. Often we look at what we can't have in the moment, Saturn, as kind of a punishment or as a negative event, when in fact sometimes it's what we don't have in the moment that gives us twice as much or something more meaningful tomorrow or next month or next year. And I think we need to keep our minds wrapped around that, or keep some perspective on that, as Venus moves closer to that opposition to Saturn. That's exact tomorrow on the 9th. We're still looking at the chart for the 8th. By the way, on the 8th, we also have Mercury making another square. I say another. These sesqui-squares have been all over the place, and we have Mercury making a sesqui-square with Uranus that's exact on the 8th. And again, this is communication that motivates us to say things that'll break out of tradition, break out of the restrictions. This is using language to bust through the Saturn. This is talking back to authority. This is not taking it and just kind of, maybe even we could call this speaking truth to authority. And it's interesting because this is even intensified more by the fact that the Sun is making a similar sesqui-square, but it's making it to Saturn, and that's exact on the 9th. Let's move the chart to the 9th, and we can see that the Sun sesqui-square to Saturn at noon on the 9th is within 10 minutes of orb, and so it's exact on the 9th, mid-morning, late morning, before noon, but it's very, very powerful. And again, this is disruptive, and it's even more significant because of the fact that Venus, which is making that opposition to Saturn, the Sun making a square and a half to Saturn, and of course we still have that Sun making that half square to Venus. So in effect, if we look at the building opposition between Venus and Saturn, which is exact tomorrow, which is exact very late tonight on the 9th or early tomorrow, that opposition between Venus and Saturn is being stimulated in a very difficult way by the Sun, which is at not the point of Thales, which would be a release point. It's at the point of Thor. It's the anxious, motivational. It's like, if you think of Thor's hammer, kind of, the wrath of, and the power of it, because the Sun is basically. This is like a T-square, where Venus would be opposed Saturn, but in a T-square, you'd have a planet that was square Venus from one side and square Saturn from the other. In this case, the sun is half square Venus and a square and a half to Saturn, and that really exacerbates this square. It's not fun. This is a difficult aspect. And yet intriguing, it's intriguing because we also have the Mercury making that square and a half to Uranus that was exact yesterday, and so the energy here is disruptive and uncomfortable. And even though Mars is now technically past its exact square to Pluto, that energy is going to hang with us for a bit. It's not going to drop off as quickly as we would like. And so we are still dealing with this deep, intense, powerful, in effect, a power struggle. And by the way, just as another aside, the moon moving through Leo by midday will be making a square to Uranus, even stirring up more energy. So this whole period of time is quite disruptive. And we have Pluto, which has been at 27 degrees 55 minutes, which is where it was on the first of the month, has moved all the way back to 27 degrees 54 minutes, meaning it's moved 1/60th of a degree. And now Pluto makes its station on the 10th. And that's technical because actually it's been stationary for a week and a half or more already, and it will be stationary for a bit even as it turns direct. But on the 10th, we have another piece that comes in that makes this whole thing even more complicated and difficult, and that is that the sun opposes Chiron exactly on the 10th, and this has been building for a few days. But remember, the sun is also still within orb of making that square and a half, the sesqui-square to Saturn, and the half square to Venus, which means that we now have Venus making a square and a half to Chiron, and the Venus square and a half to Chiron is coming into orb. It's still 1 degree away. But if you just look at the sun opposition to Chiron and Venus opposition to Saturn, that's all coming to a head at the same time. We also have this kind of sesqui-square from the sun to Saturn, half square from Saturn back to Chiron, a sesqui-square from Chiron back to Venus, and the moon is lining up with Venus at noon, and then a half square back to the sun. This is an incredibly potent and complicated, disruptive, but creates awareness. It gives us information that we didn't have, and if we're brave isn't the right word, if we have courage, even if we're afraid of what we might learn or discover, this can be a very important piece in the long-term process of how we integrate what we thought happened versus what's happening now to where this will finally lead us in the future. So this is all incredibly potent stuff. And by the 11th, we have Mars leaving Libra. And it's almost like, and it happens late in the day. So if we look at the chart at noon on the 11th, we will see that that Venus makes its exact sesqui-square with Chiron on the 11th. And by late in the day, 9 p.m., Mars moves into Scorpio, but we won't see that until we move the chart to noon of October 12th. And we can see now Mars is in Scorpio. This is like no more Mr. Nice Guy. You know, Mars can be quite an opponent in Libra, but it plays conflict like a chess game. It's diplomatic. It's logical, and it wants to not disrupt things. It wants to get to where it's going, and it's going to play for keeps. It's going to be intense, but it's going to do it in a way that's more strategic. Once Mars moves into Scorpio, it says, screw the strategy. I'm going to just kill you, or I'm going to just love you, or I'm just going to not wait. I'm going to move in the direction that my passion is indicating. And And the other thing that's significant, that even though Mars has been squaring Pluto for several days, and as it moves into Scorpio, that energy begins to dissipate a bit more. But at the same time, for several days, Mars has been moving closer and closer to a trine to Saturn, and in fact, even going back to the beginning of the month, Mars, was still trining Saturn at 5 or 6 degrees, orb. But by the time Mars moves into Scorpio, it's now it's water sign Scorpio, trining Saturn at water sign Pisces. And as soon as Mars edges into Scorpio, it is partile trine Saturn. That's exact on the 13th. But boy, this brings in a bit of stability and a bit of sensibility and a bit of deep-rooted organizational competence, so that we can take the energy that's been so crazy and maybe begin to settle it. I mean, we're not done with the disruptions of this month and the noise, especially because we are seeing that moon moving through Virgo now. And although as the moon moves through Virgo, there's a little bit of safety and stability from the trines that the moon makes on the 11th and 12th to Jupiter in Taurus, and then to Uranus in Taurus, and then on the 12th, that's on the 11th, and early on the 12th, and then the trine, so the trine to Jupiter and Uranus in Taurus, and then the trine to Pluto. So the moon moving through Virgo is actually gives us a little bit of breathing room, although it will oppose Neptune and stir up that confusion for a few hours, I think. But when the moon moves into Libra, we're now on the edge of the solar eclipse, of the new moon eclipse that is exact on October 14th at 10:55 a.m. We'll get to that chart in just a moment. But even on the 13th, we got some really intense energy cooking, because the Mars is exactly trining Pluto on the 13th. I'm sorry, Mars is exactly trining Saturn on the 13th. Its square to Pluto is beginning to fade, and we're seeing almost like a solidity, something solid is coming in behind all the noise, and yet there's still a bit of disruption and a bit of surface arguing, but it may be a bit lighter weight on some level, or not as convincing. Why do I say that? Because Mercury is making an exact square and a half to Saturn, and that Mercury sesqui-square to Saturn, that is exact on the 13th in the late afternoon. Again, we have Mars saying the energy's stabilizing, but Mercury saying, yeah, well, there's still a shouting match going on. And then we move this ahead one day more, and we move this to October 14th. And at 10:55 a.m., we can see that we have an exact conjunction of the sun and the moon at 21 degrees of Libra and 8 minutes. And this total eclipse, well, I've heard people calling this a total eclipse. It technically is not a total eclipse. Technically, it's an annular eclipse. And an annular eclipse happens when the moon is close to its apogee, meaning that the moon is at the opposite of a supermoon. Instead of being close to the Earth, it's far away from the Earth, which means that during a normal total eclipse, the moon covers the sun. But if the moon is further away from the Earth than it normally is, it doesn't quite cover the sun, and yet it's exactly centered in the sun, which means that there's a ring, not just the corona of the fire coming off the sun, which is what happens during a real total eclipse of the sun, but during an annular eclipse, it gets darkish and weird. And I had the thrill of experiencing an annular eclipse in Singapore the day after Christmas in 2019. And it was amazing because the sun actually the sky still stays a bit light. And yet the moon completely covers the sun, except there's an entire bright ring around it. And it's very cool. It's very, very powerful. But it's technically not a total eclipse, but it's an annular eclipse. And just as an aside, the word anus comes from the same word that annular does. It means a ring around. And it's like a sphincter or a tightening. And so the annular eclipse shows that ring around the sun. Now, when we look at this eclipse, the significant thing about it, when we look at any lunation, a new moon, a sun conjunct the moon, or a moon opposed the sun, or a moon conjunct the sun, we want to know what aspects is the moon making, if any. And the most potent thing that the moon is doing during the eclipse itself is that it is making a quincunx with Uranus. Now, I just want to say a quick word about quincunxes, because I've heard some astrologers who I really admire and like their work refer to this as as the eclipse is inconjuncting Uranus. And I'd really wish that people would be fussy with their vocabulary, because an inconjunct was Ptolemy's way of saying that there was no aspect. And if you're talking about a mathematical aspect of 150 degrees, that technically is 5/12 of a circle. Latin for that is quinc, 5, unx, 12. And a quincunx is an irritating, annoying aspect that, again, is not a minor aspect. It's a potent aspect, and its potency is that there's no real immediate resolution. It requires adjustment, and it's an irritation, unlike a square that can be conflict. It can be resolved creatively. Unlike even a semi-square or sesqui-square, it motivates us to do something about it. With a quincunx, there's nothing to do about it. It's there. You got the rash, it itches, and you can't make it go away, and you can't make it just kind of come into fruition so that it can disappear. It's like in this never land state of it just is bothering me. And so this quincunx between this eclipsed sun at 21 degrees, 21 degrees of Libra, within a degree of orb quincunxing Uranus at just 22 degrees of Taurus. This, I think, is the underlying theme of this whole period of time, and that is everything is annoying, irresolvable, and we got this kind of it's like the fingernail on the chalkboard. It's like, it feels awful, and yet you're hearing it, you can't make it go away. It's there, and so I think this is a potent eclipse. But I also think it's very important to remember that we're still getting the impact of Mars trining Saturn, even though the aspect was exact yesterday on the 13th, and at the eclipse, it's no longer partile, but it's still within a degree of orb. And so we still have the capability of organizing and doing something that has strength out of whatever this annoying thing is. So, and the other thing about the quincunx of this eclipse is that it's not only quincunxing Uranus very, very tightly. I mean, the sun makes the exact quincunx with Uranus the following day, midday at 1 p.m. With Uranus. But then the moon makes the quincunx to Neptune within about 6 to 8 hours, somewhere in there. So we have this kind of dance again of this annoying energy that doesn't resolve, that stirs things up, Uranus, and then kind of fuzzes things out. We can't quite figure out whether we did was the right thing or not. And thankfully, the Mars trining Saturn, I think, gives us a little bit of stability to work with all this energy. Now, once we get through the eclipse on the 14th, we're in a pretty powerful period of time that really began with the Mars square, with the Mars square to Pluto, all the way back on the 8th. But by the 15th, we have the Sun making that exact quincunx with Uranus that I already mentioned. And then the Moon moves into Scorpio, lines up with Mars in Scorpio. And then by the 16th, we have the Moon moving through mid-Scorpio. And it's not until the 17th that we get Mercury making its quincunx with Uranus. Again, the annoying communication that's being stirred up or stirring things up. And Mercury makes the quincunx with Uranus on the 17th. And then it will make a quincunx with Neptune on the 19th. So we're not done with this agitation, the rough water on the surface that is maybe kind of smoothing out on the deeper levels a bit because of all that stationary or still motion from the outer planets. But it's noise, and that noise continues as we move on. And we can still see the quincunxes in operation on the 17th, and the exact quincunx from Mercury to Uranus. But as we move on, by the 18th, the Sun is making an exact quincunx to Neptune. We also have the Sun joining up with the nodal axis. Mercury will cross that nodal axis on the 18th later in the day. Mercury is catching up to the Sun. That is an exact aspect on the 19th. So Mercury is in high focus right now. And of course, as Mercury is moving toward its conjunction with the Sun, it is also not only doing that, but it's also making that exact semi-square to Venus, the square and a half from the north node, and the half square from the south node. These are exact. And so Venus, again, is not settling well. We're not feeling comfortable in all of this. And it's an interesting period of time because as we move on to the later in the 19th, the Sun actually, Mercury catches up to the Sun, and we have this focus of communication and will, and yet it's so close to the nodal axis, it's bringing stuff up from other places, other times. On top of that, the Moon moving through Sagittarius with this eye out onto the future. The Moon moving through Sagittarius makes a sextile to the nodal axis, a sextile in trine, the point of Thales. It makes a sextile to Mercury and to the Sun, and eventually the Moon will move into Capricorn, where it will then pick up on a sextile even to Mars. But by the time we move to the 20th, we have Mercury now at the latter degrees, at late degrees of Libra, along with the Sun, making partile squares to Pluto. Remember, Mars made those same squares to Pluto back on the 8th, stirring up this deep power struggle, bringing it to the surface. Hard energy, fighting hard energy, things going on that are not normally on the surface that we're seeing duked out, or whether we're seeing it or not. There's a real power struggle going on lots of levels here. And whatever was going on back at the beginning of the month, that in the United States may have been tied at least partially to control of the Congress and the Speaker of the House, and to the fiscal issues, the budget, and all of that stuff. Now, at the end of the month, or around the 20th, when both when Mercury joins the Sun, and both Mercury and the Sun square Pluto on the 20th and the 21st, respectively, this whole thing is back in our face. We're not done with it. And again, it's noise and it's fighting words. It's people who do not want to give up their cause. And again, on October 21st, by later in the day, we have the moon aligning with Pluto as it moves through latter degrees of Capricorn, and then moves into Aquarius. And at the same time, we have both Mercury and the Sun moving from Libra into Scorpio. As they move away from that square to Pluto, what do? Just like what Mercury did earlier in the month. Just like Mars did earlier in the month. Mars, as it moved from its square to Pluto back on October 8th, and it moved into its trine to Saturn on the 13th. By the same token, Mercury and the Sun move from their squares to Pluto on the 20th and 21st. Once they move into Scorpio, they move into first Mercury moving ahead of the Sun on the 22nd. It moves into Scorpio on the 21st, and it then is immediately partile trine Saturn, but that is exact on the 22nd in the morning. Mercury is exactly trine Saturn. What's spoken is real. These are real words. We need to take them for what they are. And then later in the day, we have the moon moving through Aquarius, and then by the 23rd, we have the Sun moving from Libra into Scorpio, and it makes its trine to Saturn not until the 24th. That's exact. But even in the morning, the Sun moves into Scorpio at 9:20 a.m. Pacific time, and that means once it does that, it is partile trine Saturn. It's 2/3 of a degree of orb, less than 40 minutes of orb. And so even on the 23rd, we're already getting the sense of a new wave of stability, whether we like it or not. This may not be the stability that we want. You know, when you mix when you mix two metals like copper and tin, and you heat them up, and as they cool, they solidify and they create an alloy, bronze. Once they cool, that alloy is hardened, and it's harder than either the tin or the copper were separately. And it's almost like this Sun trining Saturn, and even the Mars trining Saturn at first, and then the Mercury, and then the Sun. What they're doing is like the energy is cooling down enough so that whatever was in flux, like an alloy, begins to solidify, and it may solidify into a shape that we don't like. Doesn't matter. It's solid, and we have to now deal with it in that form, and that's what occurs on the as the Mercury and Sun move from Libra to Scorpio on the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and the Moon moving through Aquarius by the 24th. The Moon actually moves into Pisces, catches up with Saturn, and yet even though that Moon-Saturn conjunction may be a bit kind of like running into a boundary of some sort, it's trining all of the planets in Scorpio. As the Moon moves into Pisces, it trines the Sun, then Mercury, then Mars as it's joining up with Saturn. And so again, we're getting a bit of stabilization here. And on the 26th, we have, on the 25th, the Moon moving through late Pisces catches up with Neptune, a little bit of spacey energy on the afternoon of the 25th, on Wednesday afternoon. And by the 26th, the Moon is moved into Aries, and we have Venus making an exact quincunx with Chiron. And again, this is actually the last of the major quincunxes of the month, but it's almost like whatever it is that we thought we were healing, the rash is still there. The irritation is still there. Venus quincunx to Chiron says there's something that we can learn from all of this, but it may not be an easy lesson, but it's important that we learn it. By the 27th, Mars is now making a square and a half to Neptune, and in both of these instances, these are uncomfortable. The Mars square and a half to Neptune, that sesqui-square, motivates us into action, but we're not clearest. We may be taking action based upon some higher spiritual purpose, Neptune, but we also may be taking action that is coming from some delusional perception of something that we thought is true, but it may not be true. We need to pay attention to the difference between what we want to believe and what is actually out there. Now, also note that Mars is coming into an opposition with Jupiter. It has been growing day by day. It's not exact until the 28th, but that has been coming into play as Mercury and the Sun both move toward conjunctions with Mars. Mercury will get to that conjunction with Mars by the 29th. The Sun won't get to it until next month. Actually, the Sun's conjunction with Mars, because they're moving so similarly in speed right now, the Sun won't reach that conjunction to Mars until late November. I think it's around the 20th of November, and so that's quite significant too. But as Mars is moving toward the opposition to Jupiter, that's exact on the 28th. We also have the moon moving out of Aries into Taurus, creating the second eclipse of this eclipse season. And that full moon in Aries, the full moon, it moves out of Aries into Taurus, and the full moon in Taurus at 5 degrees Taurus and 9 minutes at 1:24 p.m. on the afternoon, that's Pacific Daylight Time, of October 28th, of Saturday, October 28th. This is a partial lunar eclipse, and yet it's still an eclipse. And eclipses do what? They bring something into focus. Here, what they're bringing into focus is the need to separate something from the past. What are we separating from? Well, maybe it's the moon moving toward its conjunction with Jupiter, and that is something to do with how we've overinflated some value. Jupiter in Taurus, Taurus being the sign of values. And again, we're still running off of the energy of Uranus still retrograde in Taurus, Venus moving toward a trine with that Uranus. That's exact on the 31st. We'll get there in just a moment. But Mercury coming into a conjunction with Mars that's opposing Jupiter while this full moon eclipse is unfolding. There's too much of something going on, and we have to let go of it. We can't hold on to what we thought we were holding on to, because it's just not worth holding on to. A lunar eclipse says let go of something in the past. And so hopefully we'll be able to do that, whatever it is for each and every one of us. Again, whether it's on a personal level, a career level, a relationship level, a political level, a economic level, wherever it might be impacting. But this has to do with resources, Scorpio. It has to do with things of value. It has to do with our own personal possessions and with the complex things that we share with others. The Scorpio-Taurus axis is a very powerful and complicated axis because it's pulling the complexity of what we know when we expand beyond our own personal perceptions and senses. That would be the Taurus side, expanding beyond into what you or the other person thinks or is experiencing. That's the Scorpio side. We're moving out beyond the ego, and that's not always comfortable. The moon in Taurus wants to hold on to its position. It wants to hold on to what it owns, to what it values, to what it thinks is important, to its sense of self. And yet the complexity of that energy in Scorpio is saying, can't do it. And on top of that, Mars in Scorpio is saying to Jupiter in Taurus, I'll fight you for this. This is a tug of war. And although Jupiter may have more staying power in Taurus, right now Mars and Mercury is putting up a good fight, especially because the sun comes through that same point in the days ahead. They're very powerful eclipse, even though it's a partial eclipse. And as an eclipse goes, the energy isn't all that powerful. But as the framework of what it fits, of where it's fitting into in the big cycle of things in the month, it is very strong. Remember, the Mars opposition to Jupiter can be exuberance. I mean, we want that Mars Jupiter energy if we're heading out on a playing field, whether we're playing football or basketball or even tennis. We want that because that's competitive, and it's in the game because it wants to give everything it has. And yet we need to be careful that we're not giving everything that we have to the wrong game. Remember, Mars is still sesqui-squaring Neptune, while Mercury is sesqui-squaring Neptune, because Mercury and Mars are lined up together. And so we need to pay attention that we're not fighting the wrong fight. That's a very important thing to keep in mind here. And then that brings us day by day to the end of the month on the 29th, as I mentioned before. We have the exact conjunction. We can see that Mercury catches up from the 28th to the 9th and moves past Mars. That's the exact Mercury-Mars conjunction. That's exact early in the morning at about 7:21 a.m. On Sunday morning, the 29th. And then by very early in the morning on the 30th, and you can see here even on the 29th at noon, we can see that the moon still moving through Taurus, moving away from the full moon. The moon still in Taurus is moving between Jupiter and Uranus. And we paid a lot of attention to that Jupiter and Uranus last month as planets were impacting it. But now the full moon eclipse was the moon moving toward Jupiter, and now on the 29th at noon, the moon is moving toward a conjunction with Uranus. Why is this important? Because the moon is also making a trine to Venus on the afternoon of the 29th, and by early in the morning on the 30th, the moon moves through that conjunction, and the moon moves into Gemini, but Venus, moving slower, is inching closer to its exact trine to Uranus that, as I mentioned earlier, is exact on the 31st early in the morning at just a few minutes before 6 a.m. Pacific time. And what's intriguing to me here is that trines are supposed to be nice and easy and smooth and harmonious, and they often are. But this is a trine between Venus and Uranus, which is basically saying Venus in Virgo, which is narrowing its focus and saying, I want to limit what I like to those things which are useful or efficient or in some way have enough checks on my checklist that it's okay and I'm going to pursue it. But as Venus in Virgo forms a trine with Uranus, Uranus says, whoa, anything's possible. What about that? What about being attracted to this idea? Although there's no checklist, no checks on your checklist for this, it's all of a sudden exciting. And what if that were true? And what if I pursued this? And what if I invested in that? And what if I told this person how much I liked him or her? There's this whole sense of being attracted to those things which are new and different and out of the box. And it can be very exciting for one person, but it can be very overwhelming and fearful for another person who might be a whole lot more controlled and inner drawn or inner directed, and all of a sudden feeling like a little bit crazy as to what can happen. Here's the thing to remember as the month closes out. Although we are still dealing with a lot of those quincunx energies and sesquisquare energies, those are slowing down and becoming a bit tamer. The Venus trine Uranus is a reminder that there is excitement out there and that we can allow ourselves to feel it and be excited. But we don't have to act on every whim or every desire or every attraction, that's Venus, that we have, even if it's crazy. That would be Uranus. So, all in all, this is a very powerful month. And yet I'm going to come back to what I said at the very beginning, and that is that Pluto, Neptune, Uranus, Chiron, and Saturn, and even Jupiter have either barely moved or have slightly nudged backwards, and there's a whole lot going on. I mean, a crazy amount going on. And yet, on a deeper level, we're going to have to wait until the outer planets, one by one, turn direct. And as we mentioned, Pluto turns direct on October 10th. Saturn turns direct on November 4th. Neptune turns direct on December 6th. Later in December, Chiron turns direct on the 26th. Jupiter turns direct on December 30th. So by the time we get to January, the only planet that's left retrograde is Uranus, which turns direct on January 26th. But I think by January, we're feeling the forward motion for sure. But by late January, February, March, woo, I mean, even if the inner planets are not moving as fast anymore, the outer planets, the real tidal pull, is pulling us into the future. And so that's the larger scheme of things. Thanks for joining me here on YouTube. And also, thank you for going to ricklevineastrologer.com and signing up for my mailing list. Again, I'm not going to overload you with anything. I promise it'll be worth it, and it'll be easy to unsubscribe if you get bored of me. But I'm just trying to develop that piece of my world and shift some energy there. And I'll see many of you at Omega, at the Omega Institute. I'll see some of you at Soul Food next Friday night. That'll be on October 6th. I'll see some of you in India, and I'll see some of you mid-month if you are a Patreon member. Remember, that's patreon.com/Rick Levine, and that's $3 a month for the mid-month update. And the rest of you I'll see the beginning of November, and we'll see what's happened. That's it for now. I'm Rick Levine. Think cosmically, but act locally. Peace out.